I know everything, Joe. Every report, every complaint, every life you tried to ruin. Malik's voice was calm, unyielding, and for the first time, the officer's smug confidence wavered. What happened next will leave you stunned. Make sure you watch till the end as this story unfolds. Welcome to our channel. Here, we craft powerful stories that capture the heart and soul of human resilience. If you love stories that uplift, inspire, and reveal the strength within us all, subscribe and join our community. Your support fuels our creativity, allowing us to create even more heartful tales. Naomi lived in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone. Kids played on the street, neighbors shared food, and people helped each other with whatever they could. Naomi was a familiar face, always there to lend a hand, smile, or word of encouragement. She worked at the local community center and knew many of the people by name. Her kindness made her well-loved, and her courage made her well-respected. One chilly autumn evening after a long day at the center, Naomi walked home along the quiet streets. The leaves crunched beneath her shoes as she enjoyed the calm after a busy day. The streetlights cast soft pools of light, and Naomi felt safe, wrapped in the comfort of her neighborhood. She hummed a tune under her breath, eager to reach home, where her boyfriend, Malik, was waiting for her with a warm dinner. As she turned a corner, she spotted a police car parked near the end of the street. Naomi knew Officer Joe. He was always around, often chatting with neighbors or giving kids a friendly nod. She had never spoken to him directly but knew of his reputation. Everyone said he was keeping the peace, watching over the streets, but something about his presence tonight made her feel uneasy. Naomi walked past the car, her gaze fixed straight ahead. But just as she was about to pass by, she heard a voice call out. "Ma'am," he said, his voice loud and firm. She turned to see Officer Joe stepping out of his car, a shadow in his blue uniform under the streetlight. He had a look of authority, and she could sense something unsettling in his gaze. "Yes, officer," Naomi replied politely, though her pulse quickened. She forced a small smile, hoping he'd ask a simple question, and let her go on her way. "I need to ask you a few questions," he said, his eyes narrowing as he approached her. "We've had reports of suspicious behavior in the area." Naomi's mind raced. She hadn't heard of any problems nearby, and couldn't imagine why he would stop her. "I haven't seen anything strange, officer. I just came from work at the community center." Officer Joe took a step closer, his face unreadable. He looked at her in a way that made her skin crawl. She told herself she was overreacting, that this was just routine. But he didn't let her pass. Instead, he leaned in closer. "Why don't you come over here so we can talk?" he said, his voice low now, his hand lightly resting on her shoulder. Naomi froze. This didn't feel right. She took a small step back, trying to keep her voice calm. "I really need to get home. My boyfriend's waiting for me." But he didn't move back. Instead, his grip on her shoulder tightened just enough to feel threatening. "I think you'd better come with me," he insisted, his tone icy now. Fear crept up Naomi's spine as she looked around the empty street, hoping someone would appear, that maybe she was imagining the hostility in his gaze. But there was no one, just the silent street, the dim glow of the streetlights, and the oppressive shadow of Officer Joe standing too close. Naomi tried to break free, but he stepped forward, blocking her path, his hand heavy on her shoulder. His voice softened, almost mocking. "Why are you so nervous, Naomi? I thought you were a good girl." Her heart hammered in her chest, and her hands shook. She felt helpless, unable to move, and every instinct screamed at her to run, but his gaze held her captive. She could see now the darkness behind his expression, the twisted satisfaction he took in her fear. Naomi clenched her fists, forcing herself to speak. "Please, I just want to go home." Her voice cracked, and she hated how small and vulnerable she sounded. He looked at her for a long moment before finally releasing her shoulder. Naomi staggered back, her legs weak and her breathing ragged. She couldn't understand why he had done that, why he had frightened her like that without reason. "You can go," he said finally, a cruel smirk tugging at his lips. "But don't forget who keeps this neighborhood safe." Naomi nodded, barely able to whisper, "Thank you," before she turned and walked away as quickly as her legs could carry her. She didn't dare look back until she was far down the block, her heart racing as if she'd run a mile. She only let herself breathe once she reached the steps to her apartment. As soon as she was inside, she locked the door and sank to the floor, hugging her knees to her chest. She felt tears prick at her eyes, but she brushed them away, swallowing down the fear and the shame. When Malik found her, he was shocked to see her so shaken. He knelt beside her, wrapping his arms around her, his voice soothing. "Naomi, what happened? Are you okay?" She hesitated, still feeling the weight of the experience pressing down on her. But she knew she couldn't hold this inside. She whispered what had happened, her voice breaking, letting the fear and confusion spill out. Malik's face darkened as he listened, his grip on her tightening protectively. "I'll take care of this," he said, his voice calm but laced with anger. But for now, he just held her, and she clung to him, feeling safe and loved in his arms. Malik sat quietly beside Naomi, his arm around her, offering her warmth and safety. She had just finished recounting the terrifying encounter with Officer Joe, her voice barely above a whisper. Malik listened intently, his eyes narrowing, a storm brewing beneath his calm expression. He wanted to speak, to lash out, but he held back, knowing that his anger would only scare her more. Naomi looked up at him, her face still pale. "I don't know what he wanted, Malik. It was like he just wanted to scare me. Like he enjoyed it." Malik took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay composed. He stroked her hand gently, his voice soft but firm. "You didn't do anything wrong, Naomi. He's the one at fault, and he's not going to get away with it. I promise." Naomi managed a small smile, leaning her head against his shoulder, taking comfort in his presence. "Thank you," she murmured. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Malik held her close, feeling his protective instinct flare. This wasn't the first time he heard of someone abusing their power, but hearing it from Naomi, someone he loved with every fiber of his being, made it personal. His mind was already racing, thinking of how he could help her, how he could make Officer Joe pay for what he had done. But he didn't want Naomi to worry, so he simply held her, comforting her until she fell asleep. Once Naomi was resting peacefully, Malik quietly slipped away, retreating to the living room. He sat in the dark, his face shadowed, his jaw clenched. Naomi didn't know the truth about him. She thought he worked as a consultant, doing odd jobs here and there. In reality, Malik was far from ordinary. He was a trained CIA officer, someone skilled in dealing with powerful people, trained to uncover secrets, navigate danger, and protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Malik had joined the CIA years ago, driven by a strong sense of justice and a desire to make the world safer. But when he met Naomi, he'd promised himself he would keep her out of that part of his life, shielding her from the darkness and danger he faced every day. She was his light, his reason to stay grounded, and he'd wanted to keep her safe from the shadows he worked within. But now he could feel those shadows creeping in, inching closer with each thought of Officer Joe. This wasn't just about protecting Naomi anymore. It was about justice. Malik knew Officer Joe's type. Men like him abused their power because they thought they were untouchable, because they thought no one would dare to stand up to them. And Malik wanted to make sure Joe would learn just how wrong he was. The thought of revealing his CIA background to Naomi crossed his mind, but he dismissed it almost immediately. She didn't need to know, he decided. She had been through enough, and his priority now was to keep her safe. He would handle this quietly, without dragging her further into it. Malik's mind was sharp, and his training kicked in as he mapped out a plan. He needed to know more about Joe, understand his weaknesses, his connections, and his darkest secrets. Malik felt a surge of determination as he realized how much Officer Joe had underestimated Naomi, and by extension, him. His plan started with the basics. Malik began researching Joe, gathering information that was public and easy to access. It didn't take long to find out that Joe had been accused of misconduct in the past, though every complaint had mysteriously disappeared or been dismissed. Malik's fingers flew over the keyboard as he tracked down court records, police reports, and media stories that mentioned Joe's name. What he found painted a clear picture. Joe had a history of using his badge as a shield for his own wrongdoing, and he was well practiced in hiding his tracks. But that wouldn't stop Malik. He knew how to find information that others missed. Using the skills he'd honed over years, he dug deeper, finding old, hidden reports, names of people Joe had worked with, places he'd been, and people he might still owe favors to. Every piece of information brought him closer to his goal. Yet, even as he focused on his plan, Malik felt a tug of doubt. He was crossing a line, bringing his work life into his personal life, something he had promised himself he would never do. But his love for Naomi outweighed any rules, any reservations. He couldn't stand by while she suffered in silence. His thoughts were interrupted as he glanced at the clock, realizing he'd been at it for hours. But he knew he was just getting started. Malik had uncovered enough to know that Joe was indeed a dangerous man, a man with connections who could make things difficult for them if he found out what Malik was doing. But Malik had handled worse. He would approach this carefully, quietly. With each step forward, Malik felt the tension growing, a feeling that he was walking a tightrope over something dark and unpredictable. But he pushed it aside, choosing instead to focus on his end goal. He would protect Naomi, no matter the cost. As dawn approached, Malik closed his laptop, his mind buzzing with everything he'd uncovered. He returned to the bedroom where Naomi was still asleep, curled up peacefully. Gently, he lay down beside her, feeling his anger calm as he watched her breathe. This wasn't just about getting revenge. It was about making sure she could live in a world where she felt safe, where she didn't have to look over her shoulder. As he drifted off to sleep beside her, Malik made a silent vow. He would see this through, ensuring Officer Joe could never hurt anyone else again. Malik's investigation into Officer Joe's past was supposed to be a simple, quiet gathering of information. But with every new detail he unearthed, Malik felt his stomach churn. This was far worse than he'd initially suspected. Late one night, alone in the dim glow of his computer screen, Malik found the first piece of damning evidence. A sealed police report from 5 years ago involving a young woman who had filed a complaint against Joe. The report was filled with vague language, written to minimize what had happened. The woman had described Joe's abuse of power, claiming he had harassed her, using the same intimidation tactics he'd used on Naomi. Malik felt sick reading it, knowing the pain this woman must have endured. The report, he noticed, had been quietly closed after Joe's lawyer intervened. Malik's fingers clenched into fists. Joe had escaped once by hiding behind his badge, and it was clear he'd become more ruthless over time, learning how to silence anyone who dared to accuse him. But Malik wasn't someone Joe could silence. Malik pushed further, finding incident after incident, each account sounding painfully familiar. One report involved an immigrant family who tried to speak out against Joe's abuse, only to be threatened with deportation. Another report described how Joe had used his position to frighten a teenager into silence after a wrongful arrest. Each case had been shut down quietly, often with the victims left too afraid to speak out or seek help. The evidence painted a clear picture. Joe was a man who abused his power as easily as he wore his uniform. He operated in the shadows, protected by his connections, and used his authority to intimidate anyone who crossed him. And no one in the police force had been willing to challenge him. Malik's mind raced. Exposing Joe was now more than a personal mission. It was a fight for justice. He knew he couldn't risk drawing attention to Naomi. She had been through enough, and she didn't deserve to become a target. So he devised a plan to bring Joe's secrets into the light without revealing Naomi's involvement. Malik would gather the testimonies, the evidence he'd uncovered, and release it anonymously, ensuring Joe would be held accountable without endangering Naomi. But as he prepared to put his plan in motion, something caught his eye in one of the police files he had hacked. A recent transfer request. Joe had already applied to move to a new town several hours away. Malik's heart pounded. Joe was planning to start over, to leave behind any traces of his corruption, and find a new place to continue his cycle of abuse. Malik knew that once Joe left, he might escape accountability again, starting fresh somewhere else where no one knew his history. He realized he had to act quickly or lose the chance to stop Joe once and for all. Meanwhile, Naomi, unaware of the depths of Malik's plan, had decided she couldn't remain silent. The fear she had felt that night was still fresh, but she didn't want it to consume her anymore. She thought about all the women she knew who had kept their own pain hidden and decided she wanted to be stronger. She reached out to her closest friends, women she trusted, and told them about what had happened. Their support was immediate and powerful, filling her with courage. With her friends by her side, Naomi felt a sense of purpose. They met at her apartment, discussing how they could address the issue without drawing too much attention, speaking in whispers as if Joe might be listening through the walls. They promised to watch each other's backs, and for the first time since the incident, Naomi felt a spark of hope. But as she found her strength, Malik's urgency grew. He was torn between wanting to protect Naomi and knowing he couldn't let Joe slip away. He realized he would need to act in a way that exposed Joe to the full extent of the law. If he couldn't physically stop Joe from moving, he could ensure that Joe's reputation preceded him. The next night, Malik put his plan into action. He gathered the evidence he'd collected, testimonies, police reports, and carefully written descriptions of Joe's actions, and sent it anonymously to the town's local news outlets, along with the state attorney's office. He also reached out to certain influential figures who could ensure that Joe's transfer request wouldn't be ignored. Within hours, the evidence spread through official channels, with every witness statement and piece of evidence backing up the story of a corrupt officer hiding behind his badge. Malik felt a sense of satisfaction as he sent the final document, knowing that Joe would finally have to face the consequences of his actions. But even so, he knew this fight wasn't entirely over. Joe's reaction would be unpredictable. He might attempt to strike back, to deny the accusations and fight tooth and nail to clear his name. Naomi, unaware of Malik's efforts, planned her next steps with her friends. She decided to contact the community center director, a woman known for her activism and strength, to bring awareness to the issue of abuse of power. She felt her bravery grow as her friends encouraged her, lifting each other up, their quiet gathering becoming a symbol of resilience and unity. By the time Malik returned home that evening, Naomi greeted him with a newfound strength in her eyes. She didn't say anything about her plans, but he could see she had made her own decision to take a stand. As they sat together in the quiet, both keeping their own secrets for the other's sake, there was a sense of peace. They were both ready to face whatever came next, together. And just as Malik had hoped, the very next morning, news broke across town. Officer Joe was under investigation, his past wrongdoings brought to light for the first time. The community was in shock, whispers spreading like wildfire. Joe, faced with undeniable evidence of his abuse, would soon see his power crumble. Malik knew exactly where to find Joe. Late that night, after the news of the investigation had broken across town, Malik drove to a small, isolated parking lot on the edge of town. Joe was there, standing alone beside his car, his face cast in shadow, but his body tense. It was clear he knew the walls were closing in around him. For the first time, Joe looked vulnerable. Malik stepped out of his car, his footsteps echoing as he approached. Joe turned, his expression hardening as he recognized Malik. There was a flash of anger in his eyes, but Malik also saw a flicker of fear. He could see that Malik was a man who wouldn't be easily intimidated. "Who are you?" Joe demanded, his voice rough. "Think you can just show up here and threaten a cop?" Malik held his ground, his gaze cold and unyielding. His voice was calm, but each word hit with a force that made Joe flinch. "I know everything, Joe. Every report, every complaint, every life you tried to ruin. And now, everyone else knows too." Joe's face went pale, and he stammered, trying to keep his voice steady. "Those are lies. Twisted stories. None of it's true." But Malik saw through the denial, watching as Joe's defenses crumbled. He stepped closer, making sure Joe felt the weight of every word. "You're done, Joe. If you don't leave Naomi alone and face up to what you did, every one of your victims will get a chance to see justice served." Joe's bravado faded, and for the first time, Malik saw the true fear in his eyes. Malik knew Joe would never admit guilt out loud, but the panic on his face was admission enough. Joe's shoulders slumped, and he looked around as if searching for an escape. But Malik didn't let him move, holding him captive with a look that said everything Joe needed to know. "You're going to face this, Joe. The town knows who you are, and there's no more hiding. You're going to pay for what you did," Malik said, his tone a quiet strength, each word a promise. "You can't run from this." Joe swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he backed away, finally understanding that he was beaten. Malik watched as Joe got into his car, his head hanging, the weight of his shame and disgrace obvious. Joe drove away, no longer the man he once thought he was, leaving town and heading straight to the police station, where the consequences of his actions awaited him. Meanwhile, Naomi's friends had been busy spreading the word around town. News of Joe's abuse spread quickly, and a community that once respected him now looked upon him with disgust. The women in Naomi's circle, vigilant and united, watched closely, making sure Joe understood he was no longer welcome. Their voices gave strength to those who had once felt powerless, and together they created a united front that wasn't willing to be silent any longer. Within days, Joe's history of violence and abuse faced the full weight of justice. Multiple witnesses and reports came forward, giving testimony and evidence to hold him accountable for his crimes. Joe was ultimately arrested, his reputation shattered and his power dissolved, left to face trial and punishment for the harm he had inflicted over the years. Naomi and Malik felt a sense of justice and relief. The weight they'd carried for weeks finally lifted. The ordeal had tested their relationship but had ultimately deepened their bond, revealing the depths of their love and commitment to each other. Naomi felt overwhelming gratitude for Malik's quiet protection, his strength and determination carrying her through even the darkest moments. In the quiet that followed, they reflected on the ordeal, both thankful for the courage and resilience they had found within themselves and each other. This journey had revealed the power of standing up, not only for oneself but for others. Yet, the impact of what had happened lingered in Naomi's heart. She knew there were others who felt the same powerlessness, the same silence. Determined to make sure no one else would feel alone, she began sharing her story, hoping it would give courage to others who needed to find their voices. With Malik's support, Naomi spoke out against abuse, becoming an advocate for justice and a beacon of strength in her community. Inspired by her resilience and Malik's unseen support, the town changed, becoming a place of awareness and vigilance. People watched out for one another, ensuring no one felt defenseless. Naomi's experience became a story of hope, and with each step forward, she felt stronger, knowing that justice had been served, not only for herself and Malik, but for a community that had awakened to the power of standing together. Thank you for watching. We hope this story touched you. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe and let us know where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how far our stories travel. Your subscription and comments inspire us, helping us bring more heartwarming tales to life. Stay connected with us, and together, let's continue sharing stories that spark hope and courage around the world.